Welcome to our recorded discussion on assessment as an integral part of teaching. This is part of our recorded discussion series for EDUC 307 Assessment in Learning 2. For this topic, you will be able to cite ways to do traditional and authentic assessment, distinguish between traditional and authentic assessment, as well as what is norm reference and criterion reference assessment, and discuss the marks of quality assessment and current trends in assessment. But before we dig deeper into our topic, let us have first these reflective questions. In the context of teaching and learning, assessment obviously plays a vital role. But we need to ask, how do we need why do we need to conduct a test? And how does a test differ from an evaluation? Go ahead and pause the video if you would like to write your answers on these reflective questions. So, answering our reflective questions, we conduct tests, of course, to measure what learners know, understand, and can do on a certain point in the learning process. It actually helps us identify the strengths and weaknesses. It guides our instruction and check readiness for the next lesson. However, a test is just one tool or instrument. An evaluation, on the other hand, is a much more broader term than conducting a test because it does not end only in administering the test but also in interpreting the test results along with other forms of assessment to make judgment about overall effectiveness of our teaching strategy and the learning progress. So now, let's proceed to the classification of assessment based on the purpose of learning. I am sure this is not new to you anymore because you have learned this in your assessment and learning one. But let's just have a recap of these different types of assessment. First is we have diagnostic assessment. From its term, diagnose, we just need to check the learner's readiness before the next class. Now, remember that we do not need to record their scores because it should not be an indicator of the learning progress. It is just like testing whether or not our learner is ready for our next topic. Formative assessment, from the word form, it is to check learners' progress in the formative stage. You may be wondering, do we have to record all quizzes under formative assessment? As a classroom teacher, you may omit those quizzes who have lesser passers and most of the class, or it is in the positively skewed distribution. However, in the formative assessment, it is always important that the feedback is given. As the definition of this assessment says, to check learners' progress and also to communicate it back to our learners. The third type of assessment based on the purpose is the summative assessment, from the word mastery of the subject matter. Because if formative assessment is for assessment for learning, summative assessment is assessment of learning. So it is the totality, or it is how we measure the totality of the learner the mastery of the learner on that learning competency. Now, we proceed to the classification of assessment based on how it is formed and administered. We have the selected response and constructed response for traditional assessment. Remember that traditional is a pen and paper type of test. For selected response, we can have multiple choice and matching type or alternate response. For constructed response, we can have short answer, essay, or problem solving. I'm sure you have formulate or you have um, submitted an output way back in your assessment and learning about table of specification and test questionnaire. Um, Remember that the principles of making a pen and paper type of test should always come first before, before you're convenient in making the test questionnaire. In other words, we do not compromise the standard of making a traditional assessment because it is so easy to make. So for multiple choice of assessment and other type of selected response type, it will always be based on the learning competency you have in your table of specification. There may be questions such as, do we have to conduct essay at the end of the test questionnaire? For face validity purposes and for learners' um, end purposes, we always put the essay or include the essay at the end of all the different type of assessment or the different type of either selected or constructed response. This is because it is already, essays are already on the higher taxonomy level or higher cognitive taxonomy level. We do not make an exam that has the first test as that has essay as a first type of test. It will increase test anxiety of our learners. For short answer constructed response, you may also refer the principles of doing this in your Assessment and Learning 1 book, in which it says that it should all lines should be parallel to each other so that it won't give us or our learners a hint on how to answer. For problem solving and essay, there should always be a rubrics indicated in our test questionnaire or in a pen and paper type of test. Remember that what we are assessing is the learner's progress. So, for objectivity of checking in this type of constructed response type, we include rubrics. And rubrics, scoring rubrics is also part of our separate discussion for assessment and learning too. We move to our next type of assessment based on how it is formed and how it is administered. We have the authentic assessment. It is called non-traditional type of assessment, and the mastery of the content is expected, as well as it assess learners' skills, and same as with as essay and problem solving, it should utilize a rubric for objective assessing. A separate discussion on authentic assessment will be also provided in the series of recorded discussion. But just for the learning outcome for this topic, traditional is more of a pen and paper type of test, and authentic assessment requires a student to have contextualize assessment. Speaking of um, grading, assessment can also be according to the grading. First, we have the norm reference and the criterion reference. For norm reference, remember that we are grading the student based on the class performance. And for criterion reference, we are grading the student based on the predetermined standard. Or, for example, the learning competency or the learning objectives we have set for that topic. The purpose of using either of these two types of classification will always depend on your intention. If the intention is to make the class mark higher, then maybe you can have the norm reference. For example, if you found out that out of 50 items, the highest was only 29, which is a failing mark, you have the discretion to subtract items, such as, for example, instead of 50, making it into 40. Again, that is totally your discretion as to your intention is to make the marks higher. Another standard example of this is the percentile ranking and the ESTA 9. We base the ranking of a class or an individual or a learner based on the position or based on the marking of the other examinees. For the criterion reference, this is based on the standard. And the standard is that they will be able to achieve the learning objectives. Assessment can also be categorized according to the learner's experience. We have contextualized or decontextualized type of assessment. For contextualized, as I have mentioned earlier, these are found in authentic assessment type. However, this can also be found in the paper and pen type of test, such as, for example, in the real life scenarios or in the situational exams, situational items in the licensure examination for teachers. For decontextualize, on the other hand, it is only used for simple recall items. Now, please do not disregard the idea of giving decontextualized assessment because it would lead our learners to have contextualized one. They remember that they may not be able to achieve the creating part or the evaluating part of the revised Bloom's taxonomy if they will not be able to remember or understand the concept you have given to them. So that's why a combination of these two is always the best in making an assessment, whether it is a pen and paper or an authentic type of assessment. Now, let's proceed to the qualities of a high quality assessment. Now, quality assessment are in accordance with the contemporary view of active learning and motivation. What does it mean? High quality assessment involves learners in assessment process, beginning with setting of goals, monitoring their own learning, and building self-confidence. Because once they have less engagement in your class, it will also show that in your assessment, they will not be able to answer. The message should be clear to them, and that once they are involved, they will be able to motivate themselves to answer your assessment. A good example of this is that When you share our, as an educator, when we share our learning objectives to them, when we share what are the content of their grading, of our grading system, what evidence should be included in the formative assessment or in the summative assessment, and when they know how much or what is the weighing of each evidence in their grades. Aside from that, also, remember that high quality assessment is not just offering lower order thinking skills improvement. It should also seek to reach the higher order thinking skill, which is that when they can evaluate and when they can create something. So, in other words, high quality assessment is more of contextualized, but let's not get rid of decontextualized assessment. Another quality of high assessment is that it should be valid, it should be reliable, and of course, it should be fair. For the validity of our assessment, it should possess a content validity. Content validity means that what we teach to our learners will also be what would be in the assessment. And this is just simple curriculum alignment or constructive alignment. We check whether the questions we have formulated, either in the pen and paper type of test or in the authentic assessment, is actually the attainment of the intended learning outcomes or objectives we have provided. And it is always in accordance with the outcome based education. Assessment should also be reliable, means to say the scores should be consistent for you to say it has high reliability value. But remember, not all reliable items are valid, but all valid items are reliable. So that's why it is always important to conduct or to make our TOS, our table of specification, before making a test questionnaire for the purpose that it will help us construct a validity, a content validity of our assessment. Reliability comes after the exam. So remember, this is a reactive approach compared to the proactive approach in making a content validity of our assessment. Assessment should also be fair. In this instance, we make sure that it is not biased or against any subgroup of our students, especially if we have IP students or those in the indigenous people. Also, we get rid of the stereotypes. We construct it um, in an essence that it does not have gender biased or any discriminatory remarks on any individual, may it be in the majority or minority group. A good example is that in today's making of assessment, most of the basic education teachers do not use policemen anymore. We use police officer instead. Now, Let's proceed to the current trends in assessment. The first is the trend nowadays is that we use performance based assessment. This is the call for making our education an outcome based education. However, take note that this does not set aside the value of an objective type of test. Next is examining a higher level cognitive skills and emphasizing and integrated than isolated skills. So, current trends nowadays is that we have one assessment that will assess all the macro skills of the learners. A good example is, for example, you are given an assignment of research. For research, there we check your critical thinking skills of how to scrap out literatures and also the way you write or your grammar skills onto this. Another thing is that when you are asked during your senior high days or basic education days, when there are culminating activities done, such as, for example, the the entrepreneurship fair for the under the entrepreneurship subject, the student or the learner is actually expected to sell the products they have made. So, on that particular scenario, they are not just asked to create, they are also asked to, to market it to their prospect buyers. In that instance, their communication skills, their decision making skills, and the other soft skills are also assessed, not just an isolated skills compared to objective type of test. Another trend nowadays is the use of multiple assessment methods. So we are not anymore on a traditional classroom in which we only use one single approach, which is the pen and paper type of test. That is the reason why, under the DepEd Order 8 series of 2015, or the classroom assessment for basic education learners, there is always a written work, a performance task, and a quarterly assessment. Next is having a high performance standards, including world class standards for interpreting assessment results. In this case, we do not just set for our classroom standard, we also make sure that we follow the learning competency provided by the DepEd, since this learning competency are formulated in an international standard or in a world class standard. So we challenge our student to meet this high performance criteria. Next is involving students in all aspects of assessment. I have already mentioned this while ago that when we make assessment, or especially during the grading, we let them involve, we let them inform of when this, for example, particular quiz or particular exam, how this will be affecting their scores. When we say involving students in all aspects of assessment, we do not mean that we let them make the question itself. That is our job. Their job. Our job is to, um, the only thing that they need to know is that how will this particular assessment help them either during their learner progress or the checking of the mastery of their competency mastery. And then making standard and criteria public rather than private and secretive. This is important because, first, they should know how they should be rated. It is an important factor for a learner to be involved, how they should be rated. Say, for example, you are conducting a teaching demonstration and there is no rating sheet provided by your teacher. You might wonder how they will be rating, for example, your classroom management or your teaching strategy or your lesson planning if they haven't prepared a rating sheet and they haven't communicated it to you. The same applies to our basic education student. We do not make the criteria for judging on our own end or on our own anecdotes only. We also provide it to our students. The last one is the use of computers as part of assessment. Although in basic ed setup, the use of computers is not really the what is practiced. However, as a future educator, you must know how to assess in a digital platform. So we do not take away anymore that technology is fast and developing. So for us, the current trend in today's assessment is that we learn how to provide formative assessment through different platforms or different websites. This will make them very engaging, such as, for example, if they have cell phones or mobile phones, instead of writing it on their papers. And I think that would be it for this discussion. And for the activity, a formative assessment will be posted in our G Classroom. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you will able to achieve our learning outcome for this topic.